The sea was black that night, a restless sheet of cold water stretching beyond the limits of sight. Somewhere out there, barely visible through the wind-torn darkness, 40 German submarines crept toward a lonely convoy, struggling westward across the North Atlantic. The escorts knew the odds. They knew the mathematics of survival. And yet they stayed on course, engines humming against the swell, radar sets turning in steady circles as if searching for a future they were no longer sure they would reach. For 3 years, scenes like this had ended the same way. Merchant ships burning, lifeboats scattered across the waves, and the U-boat aces disappearing back into the night. But in early May 1943, something shifted. What should have been another massacre instead became a moment when the tide quietly, almost invisibly, turned against the hunters. Britain was starving, its fuel reserves measured in weeks. America watched anxiously across the ocean, knowing the Battle of the Atlantic would decide whether the war in Europe could even be fought. And yet, in those 8 critical weeks, the convoys suddenly seemed untouchable. What changed out there on the water? What force, silent and unseen, could overturn 3 years of German dominance at sea? For anyone living in the United States or Britain during the early years of World War II, the Battle of the Atlantic was more than a naval campaign. It was a lifeline, thin, fragile, and constantly under attack. Everything that kept Britain alive flowed across that ocean. Grain, fuel, weapons, steel, and the industrial power of North America. If those ships stopped coming, the war was lost before it could even be fought. By 1943, that lifeline had tightened to a dangerous thread. German U-boats prowled the sea with a confidence sharpened by 3 years of relentless success. They were the silent predators of the night, surfacing after dusk to run their diesel engines and hunt with the speed of surface ships. On the open ocean, under moonless skies, they were nearly impossible to detect. British radar operated on long wavelengths, and the U-boats carried receivers, small wooden boxes called METOCs, that warned them whenever an Allied aircraft was searching nearby. It was a deadly advantage, and the U-boat aces used it with precision. Their commanders became legends within the German Navy, men like Werner Henke, who carved a grim reputation across the shipping lanes of the South Atlantic, and Erich Topp, whose victories were recounted like heroic sagas in Berlin. They understood the rhythms of the sea, the habits of convoys, the weaknesses of their escorts. To Allied sailors, these men were shadows unseen, unpredictable, and lethal. The mathematics reflected the terror. In March 1943 alone, German U-boats sank 82 merchant ships in the Atlantic, nearly 500,000 tons of supplies lost to the deep. British fuel reserves dropped to a 3-month supply. Bread rations tightened. Military leaders in London whispered the unthinkable. If this continues, Britain may not survive the year. Convoys still sailed because they had to, but every crossing felt like a gamble against a rigged game. Escorts were too few. Radar was too limited. Aircraft coverage ended hundreds of miles from land, leaving a void of darkness where U-boats waited in packs. Even American destroyers, newly arrived from the East Coast, struggled to protect the endless stream of supply ships. Into this growing crisis sailed Convoy ONS 5, 43 merchant vessels pushing slowly toward Halifax, guarded by a thin screen of 16 escorts. They were entering waters the Germans believed they owned. Days earlier, U-650 had spotted them and reported their position. From bases in occupied France, Admiral Karl Dönitz ordered every available submarine to converge. Wolfpacks Star and Fink changed course and began closing in a combined force of more than 40 German U-boats, one of the largest concentrations assembled during the entire Battle of the Atlantic. To Dönitz and to the U-boat aces racing toward the convoy, the conclusion seemed obvious. The hunters had found their prey. The mathematics, once again, favored Germany. And yet, unseen by anyone on either side, the first cracks in that confidence were already spreading cracks that would widen into a collapse neither side could fully understand. As the Wolfpacks closed in, another battle, one far from the cold waves of the North Atlantic, had already begun shaping their fate. It started not on the deck of a destroyer or in the periscope of a German U-boat, but in the quiet laboratories of British scientists who had been trying for years to solve a problem their German counterparts believed was impossible. The problem was simple to state. How do you generate enough power at wavelengths short enough to see what long-wave radar cannot? The answer came from a copper cylinder small enough to fit in the palm of a hand. Inside, it sat 8 resonant cavities and a magnetic field that forced electrons to spiral in tight, furious arcs. This device, the Cavity Magnetron, produced a burst of microwave energy unlike anything previously achieved. It was the beating heart of a new generation of radar, and it would become the core of the ASV Mark III radar set, the instrument that would break the power of the German U-boats. At first, the technology struggled to reach the war. There were arguments, delays, and priorities that clashed at the highest levels. Bomber Command demanded every magnetron for its night raids over Europe. Coastal Command, which guarded the convoy routes, begged for the same technology to hunt submarines. For months, they were refused. But in March 1943, after the disastrous shipping losses that nearly brought Britain to its knees, Winston Churchill intervened. He declared the Battle of the Atlantic the nation's survival line, and 20% of magnetron production was immediately diverted to patrol aircraft. The effect was immediate and devastating. On March 22nd, a Wellington bomber using the ASV Mark III radar located U-665 inches, the Bay of Biscay. The German crew never saw it coming. Their Medox receiver, the shield U-boats had relied on for 2 years, remained silent. The aircraft appeared out of darkness at barely 300 meters, dropped 6 depth charges, and vanished again into the night. U-665 survived only by luck, but the message was unmistakable. German U-boats were no longer invisible. And yet, in the U-boat pens of occupied France, the pattern went unnoticed. Reports trickled in, aircraft approaching without warning, escorts appearing at impossible distances, but each incident was dismissed as operator error, coincidence, or stress. German engineers insisted centimetric radar was a fantasy, a concept that violated their understanding of electronics. The Wolfpacks advanced with confidence, built on assumptions already shattered. Convoy ONS 5 proved the truth brutally. In the storm-tossed darkness of early May, German U-boats attacked again and again. They managed to sink 13 merchant ships, but the cost was unprecedented. 6 submarines were lost outright. 7 more were so badly damaged they were forced to abort. The hunters found themselves hunted, tracked by an unseen force guiding destroyers and aircraft with eerie precision. Then came Convoy SC-130. 17 German U-boats attacked. Not a single merchant ship was lost. 5 submarines were destroyed. 4 more limped away wounded. It was the first time in the entire Battle of the Atlantic that a convoy achieved perfect defense against a full Wolfpack assault. For the U-boat aces, something fundamental had changed. And for the first time in years, they did not know what darkness concealed. The collapse of the German U-boat campaign did not happen in a single night. It spread like a fracture through steel, silent at first, then unstoppable. After ONS-5 and SC-130, the losses continued to mount. Boats that once slipped through the Atlantic undetected were now caught on the surface, illuminated by searchlights, or pinned beneath the waves by escorts guided with a clarity no German commander could explain. Every assumption on which the U-boat strategy had been built, night attacks, surface speed, radar detection, was suddenly unreliable. Then came the blow that Admiral Karl Dönitz felt, not as a strategist, but as a father. On May 19th, 1,943 U-954 was detected and destroyed by British escort ships. There were no survivors. Among the dead was his 2 one-year-old son, Peter, serving as a watch officer. Dönitz had once believed that his U-boat aces represented Germany's finest hardmen forged by the sea, guided by skill, instinct, and experience. Now he grieved, knowing that even the most gifted crews were dying in battles they could no longer understand. Yet grief alone did not move him. Mathematics did. In May 1943, 41 U-boats were lost. Another 37 were damaged. A quarter of the operational force was gone in a single month. In return, only 58 Allied merchant ships were sunk, and barely half of those in the Atlantic. The exchange ratio had reversed completely. Where the German U-boats once destroyed 7 merchant ships for every submarine lost, they now lost more than 1 boat for each ship they managed to sink. Just as devastating was the loss of experience. The U-boat aces who had learned the Atlantic's hidden rhythms, the swell of the sea, the angle of moonlight on a convoy, the instinctive sense of when to strike were dying faster than they could be replaced. Their replacements arrived with only 12 weeks of training. They knew the machinery, they knew the manuals, but they did not know survival. They lacked the instinct to sense when an escort was closing in, the discipline to stay submerged for hours without revealing themselves, the nerve to break off an attack before it was too late. Inside German headquarters, explanations were demanded. The reports from the front were maddening: aircraft appearing out of nowhere, escorts tracking with inhuman precision, METOX receivers falling silent at the worst moments. Some officers insisted the British had developed a new radar. Others clung to the rumor that Allied aircraft were somehow detecting faint emissions from METOX itself. That theory, despite its scientific impossibility, became the official explanation. It was easier to accept a comforting illusion than to face the truth. The Allies possessed technology Germany did not understand. On May 24th, Admiral Dönitz made the hardest decision of his career. He ordered all German U-boats to withdraw from the convoy routes at once. The offensive was over. The wolves that had once stalked the North Atlantic were retreating, not because they lacked courage, but because the sea itself had turned against them. Across the ocean, the United States watched the unfolding crisis in the North Atlantic with a clarity that came from both distance and responsibility. American shipyards were feeding the Allied war effort at a pace unmatched anywhere in the world. Yet the very lifeline carrying those weapons, engines, and supplies was being torn apart by German U-boats. For Washington, the Battle of the Atlantic was not just a British problem, it was the gateway to the liberation of Europe. If the convoys failed, every American soldier preparing for the future battles of Sicily, Italy, and Normandy would be stranded on the wrong side of the ocean. By the spring of 1943, American strategy had shifted from simply defending convoys to actively hunting the German U-boats. Very long-range B-24 Liberators, equipped with U.S. built radar comparable to the ASV Mark III radar, closed the last gap in the mid-Atlantic where submarines once hid beyond reach of aircraft. Escort carriers turned the ocean into a moving airfield. Hunter-killer groups roamed the sea, guided by intelligence, sonar, and centimetric radar that owed its greatest power to a device only a handful of scientists truly understood: the Cavity Magnetron. From a global perspective, the collapse of the U-boat offensive revealed a truth that would shape the next century of warfare. Information, not armor or artillery, decides who controls the sea. Once the Allies could see the submarines, once radar pierced the night and erased the ocean's anonymity, the German U-boats lost the very element that made them so fearsome. Even the U-boat aces, men whose names had once echoed through Berlin, could no longer rely on instinct or experience. Technology had changed the rules faster than they could adapt. Nations outside the Atlantic watched closely. In Canada, whose sailors escorted countless convoys, the victory validated years of sacrifice. In the Soviet Union, where Lend-Lease supplies kept armies alive, the safe flow of materiel meant survival. Even in neutral countries, naval observers understood the significance. The Battle of the Atlantic had become the proving ground for the future of maritime warfare. And for the United States, the lesson was unmistakable. Technological innovation, whether in radar, code-breaking, or aviation, was no longer a supporting element of war. It was the element. The ASV Mark III radar was modest in design, but decisive in effect. With it, the Allies reclaimed the Atlantic. Without it, the German U-boats might have strangled the war before it ever reached Europe's shores. When the Battle of the Atlantic finally turned in May 1943, there were no victory parades, no grand declarations. The ocean simply grew quieter. The frantic distress calls that once echoed across the wireless bands, torpedo strikes, burning tankers, shattered hulls began to fade. What remained was a truth that sailors understood instinctively. The sea never reveals its turning points in the moment. Only in hindsight do we see how a war can hinge on something as small as a copper cylinder. The German U-boats had dominated the Atlantic for 3 relentless years, guided by experienced U-boat aces who believed they understood every shadow and swell. But the rise of the ASV Mark III radar, powered by the Cavity Magnetron, rewrote the rules of survival faster than any strategist could react. That modest device, no larger than a clenched fist, stripped the ocean of its darkness and turned the hunters into the hunted. It was not a miracle weapon. It was a quiet evolution deployed at exactly the right time, and it changed the course of the war. For the Allies, the victory was more than tactical. It reopened the lifeline between North America and Britain, ensuring the steady flow of food, fuel, and materiel that made future operations possible. Without that lifeline, there would have been no Sicily, no Italy, no Normandy. The Battle of the Atlantic was not merely a chapter in naval history. It was the foundation upon which the liberation of Europe was built. For the German Navy, the lesson was harsher. Even the most skilled U-boat aces could not compensate for a technological gap they never fully understood. Courage, instinct, and experience, all the qualities that once defined the German U-boats, were eclipsed by a single fact: the enemy could see them. And perhaps that is the lasting legacy. Wars are rarely decided by brilliance alone. More often, they turn on small advantages, silent, hidden, unnoticed, until it is too late. The ASV Mark III radar was one such advantage. A reminder that innovation can reshape the battlefield long before anyone realizes it has begun. As you reflect on this story, consider the question that lingers over every conflict. Was it strategy, bravery, or technology that truly decided the outcome of the Battle of the Atlantic? We would love to hear your thoughts. If you value these forgotten pieces of history, consider subscribing. There are more stories waiting beneath the surface, stories that deserve to be remembered, understood, and passed on.